Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UCLA Tarjan Center Distinguished Lecture Series. I am Dr. Jasper Estebio, Director of Training for the Tarjan Center, and it's my pleasure to be here with you all for the very first talk of this year's series. For those who are new to us, we provide monthly talks by researchers, clinicians, and stakeholders on various topics related to developmental disabilities. Before we get started, a few announcements. We're overjoyed to announce that in addition to closed captioning, we're now able to provide live Spanish interpretation through our community partner, Fiesta Educativa. If you would like Spanish interpretation, click on the interpretation button on the bottom toolbar of your Zoom screen and select Spanish, then mute original audio. This will allow you to hear our talk live with Spanish interpretation. Throughout our talk, please submit your questions for our speaker into the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. After the talk, we also greatly appreciate your feedback, so please complete our evaluation survey, which will be sent as a link in an email with the presenter slides. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker, Dr. Elina Veytsman. Dr. Elina Batesman is a postdoctoral clinical psychology fellow at the UCLA Peers Clinic, where she facilitates social skills, career skills, and dating skills programs for adolescents and young adults with autism spectrum disorder and their parents. She also trains mental health professionals and educators in the implementation of these programs. Dr. Batesman earned her PhD in school psychology at UC Riverside, where she studied the experiences of parents of youth with developmental disabilities during their transition out of high school and into adulthood. Dr. Veytsman recently completed her doctoral psychology internship at the Help Group, where she conducted individual therapy, parent training, and diagnostic assessments for youth with a range of neurodevelopmental conditions. Dr. Veytsman has conducted peers programs in both group and individual formats across clinical and school settings, and she's researched the efficacy of the peers intervention for Latinx teens with ASD in the Inland Empire. In addition to publishing her research in top journals, such as the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, Dr. Batesman has presented at conferences around the world and received several awards for her research, including the American Psychological Association Student Research Award. Without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome our speaker, Dr. Elina Veytsman.
Thank you so much, Dr. Estebio, for that kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides with you all. So for today's talk, I will be presenting about parent perspectives on the transition to adulthood for youth with and without developmental disabilities. And so I want to begin by telling you a little bit about how I became interested in this topic and sort of my journey into this field. And so as an undergraduate at UCLA, I worked as a research assistant at the Collaborative Family Study, or the CFS, as we call it. And that's a 20-year multi-site longitudinal study that follows youth with autism and intellectual disability, as well as typically developing youth from the age of 3 and all the way into young adulthood. And it actually turned out that a decade later, that would be the same study that I used for my dissertation. And that's also the same study that I'll be presenting on today. So my initial involvement with the CFS consisted of listening to parent interviews of then 13-year-olds with and without developmental disabilities and coding them for themes related to parents' concerns and priorities for their teens. And then after college, I gained some more experience working with neurodiverse teens and young adults and their parents as a clinic coordinator at the UCLA Peers Clinic. Many of you might be familiar with that. And that's really where I developed a passion for working with young adults and their parents through social skills training. Then, as a graduate student at UC Riverside in school psychology, I had the opportunity to follow up with those same families from the Collaborative Family Study years later. And now they were 20 to 25 years old. And I got to actually interview them and their parents and really understand more about their unique experiences as they left high school and entered the world of adulthood. And so from all of these experiences, I really developed a passion for supporting young adults and parents as they navigate the complex challenges involved in transitioning into the adult world. And that's actually a big part of what I do now as a postdoc at the UCLA Peers Clinic, which is where we conduct young adult and teen social skills groups, as well as career development and dating skills groups. And so with that, I'm really excited to share with you all today some findings from the collaborative family study. And ultimately, I hope that this work will lead to the development of effective programs and supports for young adults with developmental disabilities and their families. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today, I will briefly explain the context for the study. So I'll give some background about the transition to adulthood. I will highlight some of the key issues during this period for youth with disabilities. I will then explain the objectives for this study. I'll give an overview of the methods. I'll explain the results and the implications of this work. And I will leave you with some resources and tips for navigating the transition to adulthood, which may be helpful for young adults and parents as well as professionals. Before I begin, just a quick note on terminology. So I will be talking a lot about 3 different diagnostic groups throughout this presentation, and those are young adults with autism spectrum disorder, or the ASD group, young adults with intellectual disability, or the ID group, and typically developing young adults, or the TD group. I might also use the term DD. So when I'm talking about DD, developmental disabilities, that's when I'm referring to the combined ASD and ID groups, which we combined for many of our analyses in these studies. Okay. So, as I mentioned, much of my research and clinical work has focused on this transition period from adolescence to young adulthood. So about 18 to 25 years of age or so. And that's kind of when a young person like this one in the picture leaves high school and enters the world of young adulthood. So why do we focus on this period, the transition to adulthood? Well, let's take this young man as an example. He wakes up the day after he just graduated from high school, and all of a sudden he has to take on a lot of responsibilities and make really important life decisions, like whether to go to college or get a job, whether to stay at home or move out on his own. So he might look the same, but fundamentally his relationships to others, to society, to social institutions are different. And so on top of that, the changing nature of transitioning to adulthood in today's world makes this an even more tricky time. So for example, there's actually evidence suggesting that it takes longer to reach adulthood in today's world than it did in the past. And today's young adults differ from those of the previous generation in that they're more likely to have a college degree and work full time, but they're less likely to live independently. They're less likely to be financially independent, and they're less likely to get married than those of previous generations. So this is really important from a life course perspective because a positive transition into adulthood can set the stage for a cycle of accumulating advantage and positive outcomes, while a negative transition can trigger a cycle of accumulating disadvantage and poor outcomes. So in order to foster more positive outcomes, it's really critical to understand this pivotal period of development. For young adults with disabilities, the transition represents a major shift in their eligibility for services, and that loss of services is often referred to as the service cliff. So youth with ASD and ID, for example, are especially vulnerable during this transitional period. And that can be for many reasons, including a greater reliance on parents and caregivers during this period for support, and a higher prevalence of co-occurring mental and physical health conditions as well. And so it's kind of unsurprising that the research on transition outcomes has shown that youth with ASD and ID are less likely to pursue post-secondary education and to be gainfully employed compared to their typically developing or TD peers. And then on top of that, given the social challenges associated with autism, young adults with ASD are less likely to be socially engaged, even compared to young adults with ID. And they're also less likely to have long-term relationships, get married, and have children. Notably, though, recent research has found that some of these outcomes might in part be related to parents' expectations for their young adults. So, for example, data from a nationally representative longitudinal study, the NLTS2, showed that parent expectations predicted academic and employment outcomes following high school above and beyond the youth's disability status. So, but relatively little research has examined how parent priorities are aligned with young adult outcomes. So that's one of the key focus of this research. So for youth with disabilities in particular, as I mentioned, parents are really critical during the transition period. And that's because they're often forced to fill in the gaps of the adult service system. So parents often take on many new responsibilities when their kids leave high school. And that includes supporting their young adults in navigating college, finding a job, figuring out where to live, finding services and supports. So it's really not surprising that parents often report feeling stressed during this period and feel like they have an increase in responsibilities. And they often express concern about what their role should be in supporting their young adults during this transition period. Fortunately, though, research has identified various protective factors that might lessen the negative impact of this challenging time on parents of youth with disabilities. And one of these protective factors is optimism. And that's defined as generalized positive expectancies about the future. We all know what optimism is, right? And it's a relatively stable trait that has been found to buffer the impact of challenging life events, of challenging youth behaviors on parenting stress and well-being. So that's the research study that found that. And so from a family system perspective, we can all probably imagine that parent attitudes are going to be very related, right, to the young adult's experience during transition. They impact kind of one another. And so more research is really needed to understand the influence of parent optimism and well-being on youth transition outcomes. And that represents another key focus of this study. And so the two main objectives for the study were to describe parents' challenges, worries, and goals for their young adults during the transition period, and to identify predictors of successful young adult transition outcomes, and specifically examine whether maternal well-being during adolescence and mothers' goals for their young adults' future predict young adult outcomes. So our team recruited 109 mothers who had participated in the collaborative family study, the CFS, when their children were either 13 or 15 years old. So at the time of the follow-up study, the young adult participants were ages 20 to 25. And when determining diagnostic groups, participants with co-occurring ID and ASD were combined into the ID group, okay? So the ASD group only includes participants with average to above average cognitive abilities. The reason for that grouping is that despite differences in IQ, there were no significant differences in adaptive behavior. So adaptive functioning, that's the ability to perform daily life skills. There were no differences between the ASD and ID groups, so we combined them into the ID group for analyses. And then additionally, an important note, participants with borderline ID, so IQ between 70 and 84 were also combined with the ID group. And again, that was because there were no significant differences in adaptive behavior between those with borderline ID and those with ID. Okay, and then participation in the study included completion of standardized questionnaires online, as well as a semi-structured interview. And the measures that are really central to this study were the parent interview, so a 30-60-minute interview conducted by a member of our team, as well as questionnaires that assessed parent mental health and parenting stress and optimism. And all of these questionnaires were completed both during adolescence and at follow-up in young adulthood. And then the other key measure, which I'll talk about a little bit more in another slide, is the young adult outcome measure. And this is a composite measure that was developed by our research team. And it's based on young adult transition outcomes in 3 key domains, which is participation in professional activities, social activities, and independence. So I'll talk a little bit more about this outcome later. So from the interviews, selected questions were chosen for further analysis. So 2 coders, myself and another graduate student, went through all the interviews, the transcriptions of the interviews, and we analyzed them for themes. And we let the data guide our decisions about the themes. So we didn't come in with predetermined themes. It was all just based on what we found in the data. So that's known as an inductive approach. We then created 2 separate coding systems to really understand parents' challenges and worries during this period and to understand their goals for their young adults. And then using that list of themes that we developed, we continued to independently code every single transcription for themes. And then we would meet to resolve the discrepancies until we reached consensus for all of the categories. And then throughout that process, we would constantly add and adjust themes to really reflect what parents were saying and capture the richness of the data. And then note that if a response fit clearly in more than one category, we would double code it. We would apply multiple codes so that we could capture the full content of what the parent said. And then mother's attitudes, which I'll explain a little bit later too, that was coded on a 1 to 4 scale, from exclusively negative to exclusively positive attitudes towards their young adult's future. So I'll come back to that one and explain it a little bit more. Okay, and then this is that young adult transition outcome measure that I was talking about. So this is supposed to capture overall transition outcomes, how the young adult is doing now that they've left high school. And so again, it was developed by our research team, and it's based on these 3 key domains: professional, social, and independence. And then in each domain, the scores are on a 0 to 3 scale. And so then those are all added up to create an overall TOC score. And lower scores here indicate more successful outcomes. So I know it might be counterintuitive, but lower scores, like a 0, means living independently or having many friends and high social satisfaction, having full-time employment or enrollment in a 4-year university. So lower scores are better here on the TOC. And this is primarily determined based on young adults' responses to questionnaires. But if their responses were unclear for whatever reason, we would also gather additional data from interviews with parents as well as parent questionnaires to really understand kind of where they are in terms of this overall TOC and make decisions about ratings. Okay, so the first research question that I had was, what transition goals do parents have for their young adults? And do these goals differ across diagnostic groups? And then also, do parent goals align with young adult transition outcomes? So to answer these questions, I used what's called a mixed methods approach. So we used qualitative analyses to understand the themes that came out from the parent interviews. And I'll be showing a lot of representative quotations from the interviews to really illustrate what parents' goals are. And then quantitative analyses or statistical analyses were used to examine differences between diagnostic groups and to understand the relationship between mother's goals and youth outcomes. Okay, so in all of the graphs that I'm going to show you, TD typically developing is green, ASD is blue, and ID is orange or yellow, whatever that looks like to you. So in this first graph, this demonstrates that mothers across all diagnostic groups had common goals, right, in the broad areas of professional activities, independence, and social involvement. However, the specific types of goals within these broad categories differ by diagnostic group. So in terms of professional goals, for example, we can see here that more mothers of youth with TD and ASD endorse the goal of their young adult finding a meaningful career, whereas more mothers of young adults with ID endorse the goal of their young adult simply finding a job. Okay, so let me show you these quotes to kind of illustrate the difference between what a meaningful career is and what just finding employment would be. So this mother of a typically developing young adult expressed the goal of meaningful career, right? So she said, my goal for him is that he will finish school and be a physical therapist and be in a successful career somewhere where he wants to be. And then in contrast to that, we have a mother of a young adult with ID who endorsed the goal of just finding a job. And so she said, in a perfect world, that he's got a job that seems to be relatively stable. And so the goal of finding a meaningful career reflected higher expectations for their youth's professional outcomes compared to the goal of just finding a job. Now looking at independence goals. So again, similar, right? So mothers across diagnostic groups all expressed the goal of their young adult becoming more independent. But there were differences in the type of independence goals that were reported across diagnostic groups. So mothers of TD youth, typically developing, were more likely to endorse the goal of financial independence. On the other hand, mothers of youth with ASD and ID were more likely to want their young adults to live independently from parents and to develop daily life skills. So these differences are illustrated here in these quotes. So this mother of a TD young adult expressed financial independence goals. So I hope that he is financially self-sufficient. On the other hand, a mother of a young adult with ID expressed, I would like there to be more programs that help him learn how to be more functioning, because 20 years from now, I'm probably not going to be around. So that's a daily life skills goal. And this was actually double coded, this goal, as caregiver aging, which I'll come back to in a little bit. But that was one of the main themes that emerged for mothers of youth with developmental disabilities was what will happen when parents pass away. And I'll come back to that. And then we have here a mother of a young adult with ID who expressed the goal of her young adult living independently. So she said, I would like to see her in an independent living situation with roommates. I'm not going to call it a group home because that term and that model is wrong, but an organized living situation with structured social activities. That to me would be the perfect setup. I sometimes think I'm going to have to be the one to create it. All right. And then social goals. Again, all moms reported social goals, but the types of social goals across diagnostic group were different. So all moms wanted their young adults to find relationships. This was common among youth with and without disabilities, find love and find happy, healthy, romantic relationships. But more mothers of TD youth expressed the goal of their young adult building a family and having children, whereas mothers of youth with ASD and ID were more likely to have friendship or social support goals for their young adults. So these quotes illustrate those differences. A mother of a TD young adult expressed, I want the best for her and I want her to be happy. And of course, I want grandbabies. So definitely want the kids and family and kids there. And then mom of a young adult with ID said, I'd certainly like him to get interested in dating. And this was definitely a common goal across all the groups. And then this one more common among mothers of young adults with disabilities, friendship, social support goals. So I think his top 3 goals should be relationships, forming them, making them. Like, how do I do that? Navigating those kinds of waters. Okay, and then so that again, that really kind of speaks to the nuanced differences in the broader types of goals, right? Well, all moms want their kids to be independent, to have successful professional outcomes, to be social. There are nuanced differences in the specific goals that moms had across diagnostic groups. Okay, now this analysis is examining whether mothers' goals aligned with youth transition outcomes. And so to do this, we conducted 3 separate, they're called multiple regression analyses. And that was conducted for each domain of the TOC, the transition outcome composite that I talked about. So we conducted them separately for professional goals, social goals, and independence. And so mothers' goals in that related area, right, like professional, for example, and the young adult's diagnostic status, so whether they were typically developing or had a developmental disability, were examined as predictors of the young adult's outcome. And so this table presents results for the professional domain, okay? So overall, the findings demonstrate that higher maternal professional expectations predicted more positive young adult outcomes on the professional domain, and that was even when controlling for the young adult's diagnostic status. So in other words, young adults whose moms endorse the goal of simply finding a job as opposed to finding a meaningful career had less successful outcomes in employment and education. Okay, so it's really important, right? This signifies that mothers' goals and expectations really relate to youth professional outcomes. And having that higher goal of finding a meaningful career related to more successful outcomes, regardless of the young adult's diagnosis. And then mom's goals did not significantly predict young adult social or independence outcomes when controlling for the diagnostic status. So they were correlated, they were associated with outcomes, but it didn't predict their outcomes beyond the diagnostic status. Okay, our second research question was, what challenges and worries do parents have during the transition period? And how do those differ across diagnostic groups? So again, we used a combination of statistical analyses and qualitative thematic analyses to really understand parents' challenges and worries, and then to examine differences by diagnostic group. So, similar to goals, moms across diagnostic groups endorsed common concerns. And the common concerns were worries about their young adults making smart life choices, being financially stable, challenges with parent-child conflict, worries about their youth's romantic relationships, worries about young adults' mental health, and then safety concerns. So let me illustrate a few of these for you. This is probably the most common concern that was reported, or it was the most common concern reported. So about 2/3 of moms reported the concern of making life choices. And I thought this was a really great quote that illustrated this theme really well. The terrible twos, no such thing. Tantruming threes, easy. Teenagers, easy. It's the 20-year-olds that are hard. For me, little kids, little problems. Big kids, big problems. Once they are launched, the whole world's open to them. And hopefully they've taught them well and they make good choices. 20-year-olds, the decisions they are making are big decisions, whether it be their major, who they date, if they are going to experiment with drinking or drugs. It's bigger, more life-changing or life-impacting decisions. So give me my 6 little kids any day and you can have my 20-year-olds. So really illustrating how important this transition period, the choices that are made during that time. Okay, another really common theme for moms across all the different diagnostic groups were concerns around their young adult becoming financially independent. So that was expressed here by a mom of a young adult with ID. She said, I worry that the transition into a career might be difficult because, well, first, it's going to be difficult for him just to get that job. He's not going to interview well. He's not going to interview well at all. I think that he applied for and got an interview for Target and he wasn't hired. 2 interviews and he wasn't hired. More than likely because he doesn't interview very well. And so again, this quote kind of reflects the additional challenges that are faced by young adults with disabilities and not only becoming financially independent, but just finding a job and maintaining gainful employment. Okay, some other common concerns that were common across all diagnostic groups were parent-child conflict. So that was illustrated by this quote over here. So he basically is an adult and it was his responsibility to maintain those grades and those credit levels and keep that scholarship alive. Unfortunately, it was his responsibility, but it was our money. So it was kind of difficult. That was a mom of a TD young adult. And this theme actually did come up more for moms of typically developing youth, not statistically significant, but anecdotally, it did come up a lot more for moms of TD youth than youth with disabilities. Then we had safety concerns. So safety concerns were endorsed by about 1/4 of moms across diagnostic groups, including this mom of a young adult with ID who said, I worry a lot about the things she cannot understand, like what's good and what's bad. I worry about the older people that are on social media and her not understanding what's right or wrong on social media. Also a common concern that came up with regard to safety, right? Safety online and on social media. Young adult mental health was another common concern. And as this mom of a typically developing young adult reported, the anxiety, depression, nursing school, all that. And I'm like, oh, dear goodness, make it stop. Again, mental health, right? Common concern for all young adults. Don't have to have a disability to have concerns around mental health. And then finally, romantic relationships emerged as a common goal, as well as a challenge by moms across diagnostic groups, as illustrated by this quote of a mom of a young adult with ASD. I would say love was the most challenging. Will he find a companion that will accept him and support him and love him? I think that's probably my biggest fear or my biggest worry. Okay. Now, another challenge that was reported by moms across diagnostic groups was finding the right balance between providing support and guidance and allowing their young adult space to become more independent. And so this theme was really common regardless of the youth's diagnosis, but where young adults were on this continuum of dependence differed by diagnostic group. So for example, concerns of mothers of youth with ID reflected the youth's continued dependence on the caregiver, while mothers of TD youth were more likely to express concerns around watching their young adults struggle from afar. So kind of letting them make their own decisions and watching them have to fail. Mothers of ASD youth, interestingly, were right in the middle. So that really reflects that greater struggle in the ASD group with navigating the balance between providing support and allowing their young adult greater autonomy in the ASD group. So to illustrate these different levels on the continuum, I have these 3 quotes. So mom of a young adult with ID. This again reflects continued dependence on the caregiver. She said, the hardest part for me, so a child needs its mother, right? But at some point they start not to. I never had that. That's hard for the parent because you're done. You're ready to not have to be there every moment. I think it's biological because it is so hard to be there for his every need. Okay, now on the flip side of that, we have a mom of a TD young adult who was more watching her young adult struggle without providing that continued guidance. So she said, I just get to watch her make mistakes and see her fail and see her make bad choices. And I can encourage her, but I can't ground her in. I can't make her do anything, you know? I have to just watch and see what happens. And so that's really hard. And then we have the moms in the middle. And this was, again, most of the moms of young adults with ASD were somewhere in the middle. They were struggling with finding the balance between allowing their young adult to be independent and providing support. So this mom said, I feel like my job is being as supportive as I can while still trying to set appropriate boundaries for somebody living at home and continue to figure out the balance of when to parent and when to let them fall and make mistakes. It's very, very tricky. Okay. And then several concerns emerged that were unique to mothers of youth with disabilities. And these included challenges with the parent's own mental health, concerns around the young adult being socially victimized or discriminated against, and also lacking social support, caregiver aging, which is what I mentioned, so what will happen after parents pass, and then navigating the adult service system. These concerns were all unique to parents of young adults with disabilities. And then on the flip side, mothers of typically developing youth were more likely to report challenges with transition loss. So transition loss was defined as missing their young adult or being separated from their young adult. So let me illustrate these in some quotes. So these are, again, differences in social concerns by diagnostic groups. So moms of young adults with disabilities more likely to be concerned with victimization. So put simply by this mom of a young adult with ID, that someone will take advantage of her. That was her biggest concern. We hear that a lot. Another one really common, social support. A mom of a young adult with ASD expressed concerns with watching him cry because he's lonely. I see all his typical friends and my friends who have kids his age that are typical. And oh my God, they're in Peru, they're in Paris, they're in school for a year in Scotland. They're doing all kinds of grown-up people activities. My son, again, home alone, so lonely, doesn't know what to do. He's looking at Meetup for different groups. A couple other ones that are, again, unique to parents of young adults with disabilities. Parent mental health was a big challenge that was described by these parents, their own mental health, right? So she said, this mom of a young adult with ASD said, the hardest part is being tired. Like, I want to be able to support him, to be successful, and I'm exhausted. It's like sometimes I have to drag myself out of bed because I'm so tired, and I'm like, how much longer can I hang on? Caregiver aging, another one that I mentioned, it's really common. It scares the crap out of us. What's going to happen to him? He has no siblings. He's going to have nobody. Who's going to take care of us when we're old? It's a mom of a young adult with ASD who said that. And then this last one is navigating services. And so this mom talked about the challenges that she's experienced navigating the adult service system. And she reported her young adult is using 3 agencies and her brother is using another 3. So for me, that is 6 agencies to manage. Sometimes I feel like, what is the alternative? I wish they could all just go away. Or better yet, maybe I can hire someone to coordinate all of these services. Wouldn't that be great, right? And then this was the one that I talked about that's unique to parents of typically developing youth. And it's about missing their young adult, right? Because their young adults are more likely to live independently. And so this mom expressed her concern with just missing him. I miss him. It's just different because he's not here. He's not in my house. So that is a different way of communicating and a different way of loving than you're used to as a mom, because you're used to him being physically right here. So that's the hardest part, that they're not here. Okay, so the third research question is, what about the role of parental well-being? So do parent well-being and optimism during adolescence impact parent attitudes towards their child's future in young adulthood? And then on top of that, do these parent well-being variables impact their young adults' transition outcomes? And so again, another set of quantitative or statistical analyses was conducted to examine how mothers' well-being during adolescence related to their future attitudes and to their young adults' outcomes. Okay, so this is what I was mentioning about mothers' attitudes being coded on a 1 to 4 scale, from exclusively negative to exclusively positive. Okay, so on average, before I get into the quotes, on average, moms of typically developing young adults expressed more positive emotions towards their young adults' future compared to moms of young adults with disabilities. Okay, so let's look at some of these quotes. So a mom of a young adult with ASD reported, and this is rated as exclusively negative. Every year goes by, and there are days when I feel depressed and I get really upset, because I think about his future, and it's pretty sad that all this time, no matter what I've done, it hasn't been enough to help him succeed as an independent person. Okay, now let's look at in contrast, this other mom of a young adult with a disability, with intellectual disability, had a lot more of a positive outlook. She said, I think his future is pretty bright. I think we live in a time where people are more open, more inclusive, more likely to accept people with disabilities. People with Down syndrome have come a long way, and I think they're making great progress. So we see two sides here, right? From exclusively negative to exclusively positive. But the vast majority of moms, of course, fell somewhere in the middle. They were either leaning negative or leaning positive. So let's look at this next quote. Mom of a TD young adult said, pretty much wishful thinking. She's very content to live off of unemployment. These couple of classes are not doing anything. So kind of leaning negative, right? Like she's kind of wishful thinking, right? But kind of still leaning negative here in this quote, as we can see. And then another example here of leaning more positive, this mom expressed cautious optimism. So it's a mom of a young adult with ASD, and she said, I have sadness and fear, but overall hope. Because if I give up hope, I fall into a pit of despair, and that does no one any good. And I know that. I feel like I'm a cautious optimistic. It's hope grounded with honest fear for him, right? So in the middle, kind of realistic, right? Like not everyone's going to fall at one of these extremes. Most moms fell somewhere in between. But when we think about this, these differences between groups might best be viewed in the context, again, of family systems theory, in that moms' experiences during their young adults transition are impacted by their young adults experiences. So in other words, the complex challenges of young adults with disabilities during that transition period impact their mother's outlooks on their children's future prospects. Okay. And then to look at this a little bit more statistically, a multiple regression analysis examined mom's well-being in adolescence and the youth's diagnostic status. So again, either typically developing or having a developmental disability as predictors of mothers' attitudes towards their young adults' future. So results here suggested that parenting stress in adolescence predicted mothers' attitudes towards their young adults' future in adulthood above and beyond the young adult's diagnostic status. So again, moms who were less stressed out when their children were age 13 or 15 had more positive outlooks towards their kids' futures in adulthood, and that was regardless of the youth's diagnosis. So this finding has really important implications for intervention, because it suggests that regardless of the young adult's diagnosis or the youth's diagnosis, addressing parenting stress early on is likely to have downstream effects on mothers' outlooks later in life. Okay, now this last analysis looked at the relationship between mother's optimism in adolescence and young adult transition outcomes. So in both young adulthood, or in both adolescence and young adulthood, moms in the TD group reported having lower parenting stress, higher optimism compared to moms of young adults with disabilities. And so that again highlights the very different experiences of these moms, as well as the impact on their psychological well-being. But interestingly, results of this analysis revealed that higher maternal optimism in adolescence predicted more successful young adult outcomes on the TOC, even when controlling for the young adult's diagnosis. So again, it suggests that moms who are more optimistic might have contributed to their young adult successful outcomes by having that sort of creativity and positivity to lead their young adults to opportunities that ultimately maybe helped foster their success. Okay. So overall, the findings illustrate just how challenging the transition to adulthood can be, regardless of disability status. So results from the qualitative analyses, the interview coding, highlight the key issues that surround the transition period across diagnostic groups. Concerns around young adults' mental health and safety, right? Finding the balance between providing support and guidance and allowing young adults more autonomy. The findings also highlight the unique challenges for parents of young adults with autism and intellectual disability, including concerns around navigating the adult service system, what will happen when parents are gone, worries about their young adult being socially isolated or victimized, struggles with their own mental health. And then the results from the statistical analyses suggested that mothers' well-being in adolescence predicted more positive attitudes in adulthood, as well as more successful young adult outcomes. So that finding really reflects the importance of harnessing positivity early on to foster more positive young adult outcomes. And then in addition, parent interventions for parents of youth with disabilities might have longer lasting impact on both the parent and youth if they address parenting stress. So for example, mindfulness-based parenting interventions have demonstrated positive long-term effects for improving not only parental well-being, but also child behavior. Additionally, the results suggested that higher maternal expectations were related to more successful youth professional outcomes. So that means that parent training programs should really be emphasizing the importance of high parental expectations. And so ultimately, these findings really highlight the need to support parents of young adults with disabilities during their kids' transition out of the school system. And my hope is that these findings can guide educators in implementing more effective supports for parents, like connecting parents with adult agencies, providing psychoeducational workshops and resources to parents on the transition to adulthood. And that's actually something that I began on my doctoral internship at the Help Group last year, and it's something that I'm hoping to continue developing as part of my postdoc at UCLA. Okay, so I want to leave you with some resources and helpful tips based on all of this information that I presented. Okay, so let's start by talking about some resources and tips for employment and post-secondary education. And these are pretty brief, but I'm going to give you a QR code that links you to a transition resource guide that I created that's very comprehensive. So don't feel like you have to write all these things down. They're all in the transition resource guide. And I'll put my email in the chat as well. So if you have any trouble accessing it through the QR code that I'll leave you with, then feel free to email me and I can send it to you. Okay, so here's some tips for finding employment and identifying career goals. Number one, discuss career interests with your young adult. It's really important to start having this conversation early, right? Don't wait until they leave college. This is something that can be done way before, thinking about career interests, how their interests might align with their personality and their values and their interests and their aptitudes. And then develop a career action plan with concrete steps, right, of helping their young adult actually figure out what steps do I need to take to ultimately reach my career goal. And this usually starts by identifying where you want to be 10 years from now. If that feels like too long, identify where you want to be 5 years from now and work backwards and figure out the steps that the young adult can start taking now to get there. as well as the professional contacts that might be required. Who do they need to know and talk to who can help them reach their ultimate career goal? Maybe it's teachers, professors, bosses, supervisors, people like that, or family friends. And then this is part of that, right? Identify helpful contacts for professional networking. Reach out to those contacts and conduct informational interviews. So informational interviews are where potential job seekers seek guidance and advice from people who are already in that career. So figure out what contacts do I have, or how can I meet contacts in my field of interest, and conduct informational interviews with them. These can be short, they can be 20 minutes. And of course, practice those before doing them, right? Because this can be a really great opportunity for networking and can give us leads that will help us find jobs. So it's important for parents to practice, or for professionals to practice informational interviews with young adults prior to sending them off to do them. Okay, here are 3 self-advocacy tips for employment and post-secondary education. Number 1, support your young adult in identifying their strengths and challenges and turning their challenge into a strength. This is going to be really helpful when it comes to requesting accommodations in the workplace or in post-secondary education settings. It's important that our young adults can identify what their strengths are, as well as their challenges, right? Both are important, but it's also important to teach them how to turn a challenge into a strength, right? Because we don't want to go up to an employer and just tell them what our challenges are. We want to find a way to turn some of those challenges into a strength. Discuss what types of accommodations and supports your young adult will need to succeed in college or the workplace, and then practice requesting accommodations with your young adult, right? Sit down and figure out, how would I do this? Am I going to put in the request in writing? Am I going to set up a meeting with my supervisor to ask about this? There's lots of examples for how to request accommodations that you can find online as well, and lots of different types of accommodations. And then identify current or future mentors in college or the workplace. It's really important, right, in every stage of life to have a mentor who helps you get to the next place. So helping young adults figure out who's someone in their current education or work setting who can sort of guide and support them, and or how can they meet potential future mentors if they don't currently have one. Here's a couple resources that can help young adults in navigating that transition from college to career. So the UCLA Peers for Careers program is a research program that may soon turn into a clinical group. And it's a 20-week program for college students with autism who are interested in acquiring job skills and sort of the soft skills to help them obtain and maintain employment. And also provides them with an internship experience to practice the learned skills. So all those things that I just described with, requesting accommodations, finding a mentor, practicing informational interviews, those are all things that are covered in this program. Integrate Autism Employment Advisors, another really great resource online. So this is a new website that offers employment resources for candidates on the autism spectrum. And it also helps organizations identify, recruit, and retain professionals with autism. So this might be a really good resource, both for employers seeking to hire neurodiverse young adults, as well as for candidates. Mentra is another neurodivergent friendly platform that actually matches neurodiverse individuals with employers that value the unique strengths that they might bring to the workplace. Their website. Okay, Autism Goes to College. So this is actually based on a study that was conducted by some of my colleagues at UC Riverside. And it's a podcast and a documentary film that was based in research that we conducted at UCR. And it's really about the experiences and needs of college students with autism. So it follows, I believe, 4 college students as they navigate kind of the complex college atmosphere and environment. And their website, Autism Goes to College, has a lot of great resources for navigating college for people on the spectrum. This is another really great resource for post-secondary education. It's from the U.S. Department of Education, and it's a guide for students with disabilities and how to prepare for post-secondary education and how to know their rights and responsibilities. So it has a lot of great information about accessing accommodations and supports in a college environment. Again, all these things are in the guide that I'm going to show you the QR code for. ASAN is another one, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They have a handbook on self-advocacy for college, published for autistic students and written by autistic adults. And then here are some resources and tips for building social skills and social engagement. One of the tips here is to find a source of friends with common interests. So this might start with a discussion with young adults to think about what groups or social activities might be a good fit for them based on their interests. And then the next step would be creating a plan for joining social activities where they can meet other people, potential friends, and sort of find a source of friends with common interests. Meetup.com provides really great opportunities for this. So the groups are all based on common interests and they're primarily recreational activities. And they have things like movie meetups, gaming, hiking, alumni groups, things like that. This is an example of a group that you can find on meetup.com, Los Angeles Neurodiversity, or LAND. It's a social support and advocacy community for neurodivergent adults. And they have lots of social recreational events, as well as sort of more support group type events. The help groups Advance LA, Club LA is another really great social opportunity for young adults on the spectrum. They have lots of fun activities like movie nights and gaming and bowling, beach days, museums, things like that. That's also available on meetup.com if you search for Club LA. And then the UCLA Peers for Young Adults Social Skills Group. That is a social skills program that targets all of these skills and really helps teach young adults the skills needed for making and keeping friends. And Peers for Dating is another research study brought by the Peers program at UCLA that just teaches dating skills. So skills for finding and maintaining romantic relationships for young adults with ASD. And then lastly, here's some resources for and tips for accessing adult services. Again, all in the guide that I'm going to show you the QR code to soon. So these are some tips for navigating the adult service system. So each regional center has a page that lists the typical services provided to consumers for each age group. So an example of this, and I'll go back to this slide in 1 second, is Westside Regional Center. They have this page for services and supports ages 18 to 22. So every regional center should have this. So that's important to become familiar with and see what kind of opportunities there are through that. Don't be afraid to ask for and advocate for the services that you think your child needs, especially for adults, right? The regional center will not always tell you about all of the services that are available. So it's important to know what's out there and ask for those things. And then explore all the options before going to court. I'll talk about this in another slide in a second, but there's lots of options other than conservatorship, for example, things like supported decision-making, power of attorney. And then start working on generic services for this age group if you haven't already. So things like IHSS, SSDI, Medi-Cal, it can take a while and it's important to have that in place. This is what I was talking about conservatorship. This has a lot more information about it. The California Courts Self-Help Guide, it has a lot of information about general and limited conservatorships, different options and step-by-step guides to doing those things. And this is what I was saying with understanding all the options. So again, this is available on the Self-Help California Courts website, but basically there's a lot of other less restrictive alternatives to conservatorship. And it's important to know that those options are out there and think about what you're looking for your young adult before determining what option suits them best, suits your family best. Okay, so this is what I was promising you, the resource guide. I'm going to leave this page on for a second, but again, this is a comprehensive resource guide that I created. It's geared towards families in Southern California, but there are some state and national resources on there as well, so it might be helpful for people who are out of state too. But yeah, it's really for parents, for young adults, also for professionals, and it's meant to just provide a lot of different resources, supports, providers for this age group, for the transition to adulthood period. And again, if you have any trouble accessing this QR code or accessing this guide, I will put my email in the chat in a second, and feel free to email me and I will send it to you. Okay, and I just want to thank everybody so much for your attention and for listening. And of course, this work wouldn't be possible without the amazing leadership of the principal investigators, Dr. Bruce Baker, Dr. Jan Blatcher, Dr. Keith Cernick of the Collaborative Family Study, the generous funding support that we've received, all of the staff and grad students and research assistants who have helped with this work. And then, of course, the young adults and their parents who participated in the study and have given their time and insight over the last 20 years. All right, and with that, I will pause for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Veytsman, for that wonderful talk. I know that transition to adulthood continues to be such a highly requested topic, and so we're so grateful for your presentation and providing some insight into, not only things that are unique to individuals with disabilities, but some commonalities too. So I'm going to start off with just a first question to put together my reflections and a question. And then I'm going to prompt our audience to please submit any questions that you have for Dr. Veytsman into the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. And that will give you some time to do that. But I think Dr. Veytsman, what I was so struck by was that relationship between parent optimism and as such a strong predictor for their adults' future outcomes. And I know you provided such a wonderful resources and tips for everyone here, but I was just really thinking if we're really considering more of a systems approach, right? You talked about family systems, but more of a service systems approach, how we might be able to integrate this into something like the Regional Center Self-Determination Program or something like that. What would you have as any of your recommendations in terms of systems?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to not only provide support for young adults, but also for their parents, because as we can see, this is a really challenging time. It's stressful for parents to help their young adults navigate this. And the things that parents have talked about that have really helped during this period are finding a community, support groups, or just social groups where they can really find other parents who they relate with about these things and what they're going through. And so, regional centers or systems can also provide those opportunities to connect parents with one another for sort of peer mentorship type opportunities, as well as groups that actually maybe more sort of psychoeducational or even more like group therapy type groups for parents that offer more of that, psychological support during this time. So mindfulness-based interventions have had a lot of promise for kind of improving parental attitudes and optimism and things like that. And other maybe CBT-based interventions as well to really help parents cope during this stressful time.
Absolutely, right. We see clearly through your research that there is such a strong relationship here. And if we want to, continue to support these young adults, then we do need to work with the family in those types of ways. Okay, so I'm going to jump into some of our audience Q&A. First question from Olivia Elson. Is this research study published yet?
That's a great question. There are a lot of studies that have been published from the Collaborative Family Study, probably over 100 papers actually over the years. It's because it's been going on for 20 years. This particular one is currently in the works. My dissertation is published and available to the public, but it's 100 pages. So I'm not going to make you all read that, but I am currently working on publishing my dissertation, and that'll be a much shorter, more easily digestible paper. So you can look for that in the next year or so. I can put a link to my dissertation in the chat. That's what's available for now. And that kind of has this entire, everything that I just presented is in there.
Wonderful. Stay tuned, everyone. So, all right, next question is kind of related to more of the demographics of the study. So were fathers' attitudes or socioeconomic status of the parents taken into consideration?
Yeah, so we did interview some fathers, like many other research studies, we had a lot more mothers who were willing to participate. We did try our best to recruit fathers as well as mothers. So it wasn't just, one parent per young adult. We tried to get both parents to participate. But in order to do these analyses and maintain independent data points, we couldn't include both fathers and mothers of the same young adult in the research. And usually it was for the same young adult. So it wasn't just the father while they're participating. So that would be really great to look at. In terms of socioeconomic status, it was a variable that we looked at. There were, you know what, the one interesting thing that we found was that the participants who ended up participating in this follow-up study, there were differences in the socioeconomic status of those who continued participating. So the follow-up participants represented a higher socioeconomic group compared to the ones who participated in the 13-15-year sample. But we did not look at that as a predictor in this particular study. There are other studies from the collaborative family study, though, that look at some of those variables, demographic variables.
Absolutely, right. And if we're continuing to talk about systems and particularly family systems, those are really important considerations. Another question about some of the analyses. One question from Janice Morse is whether gender of the young adult was looked at specifically.
So it was not looked at in this particular study, but again, we have other studies that are more, their focus is kind of on looking at gender differences. We had a lot more males in our study in general than females, but no, we didn't look at that in these analyses.
Okay, excellent. And then one more question from the audience before I wrap things up is about more of the kind of resources and where we can find additional resources. I know that we have the Q&A QR code provided too. And so all of the slides from Dr. Batesman will be sent out shortly from the UCLA Tarjan Center email. And then I think the last question that I have, Dr. Batesman, is more about, kind of next steps. I know that you said that you want to take this work to continue to build upon your postdoctoral research and beyond, but what are kind of next steps that you're interested in looking at?
Yeah, so last year on internship, I actually piloted a 4-week psychoeducational group for parents of high school juniors and seniors at the Help Group, which is a large nonprofit agency serving youth with developmental disabilities, and collected kind of feedback and assessed needs of parents in terms of what was covered, what else they would like covered. And the biggest feedback was that it was too short and they want more of it. And why didn't they have this sooner? So based on that feedback, I would love to do something similar at UCLA and develop a little bit of a longer program. And it would be sort of like a split between a psychoeducational and support group for parents of high school youth and maybe right out of high school youth with disabilities, to really provide them with that guidance and education, as well as that community and social support.
Right, so needed. I think given the findings from your study, as well as what we as clinicians and people who work in this field know anecdotally, this is in such high demand. So you're very, very needed to be in this space. All right, thank you so much, Dr. Batesman, for your wonderful talk. Just to wrap up with a few housekeeping things. So to our audience, thank you all for being here for our very first lecture for the 2022-2023 lecture series. The recording of Dr. Batesman's talk, as well as the slides, will be made available and sent out to everyone once we have it. So please keep an eye out for those. I also want to give a plug for our Plain Language podcast, In Other Words, in which our self-advocacy and community liaison, Keisha Weller, will interview all of our distinguished lecture speakers, including Dr. Batesman, into our podcast. So that will be available everywhere that you listen to your podcast. So please keep an ear out for those. And then our next lecture series will be on Monday, November 14th, always on Zoom. In the meantime, please feel free to contact the Tarjan Center with any questions, and follow us on all of our social media to stay updated on all the goings on here at the center. And with that, I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially Dr. Batesman for presenting her incredible work and for coming back to UCLA. Welcome back, Dr. Batesman.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.